In this lesson, we're going to look at how we can use authentication to protect our server routes. So let me go into Hopscotch here, and I've set up this one route here to get a protected lesson, or a lesson that should be protected, rather. If I hit send, then I can get all of the data for this lesson in chapter 2. So the path here, chapter, second lesson, should be protected because we're only giving away that first chapter for free. Yet, if I know the endpoint, I'm able to get that data even if I'm not logged in. And this is because although we have our authentication on the front end, like so, if I try and go into chapter 2, it forces me to log in. But that authentication only exists when rendering pages on the front end. And if we directly go to our back end, to our server routes, that data is not protected. So we're going to fix that. To do that, we will use server middleware. Now, this is different than route middleware because route middleware, we can define which routes it's run on, where server middleware is run on every single server request. Now, at first, this may sound like a big drawback because we cannot define per route what server routes the middleware is being run on. But if you are familiar with Express or other backend server frameworks, this works in very much the same way. We can define middleware and they're run on every single request. So what would we use server middleware for? So there are broadly two main reasons. The first is to inspect the request object. So we can inspect it to see, does this contain this type of header for authentication reasons, which is what we're going to be using it for, and potentially extending that request object, which is also what we're going to be doing. So we can use this for authentication. We can use this for telemetry if you want to record timing data to see how long different endpoints take. You can add that information in using this middleware. You can do logging. You can do error handling, all sorts of things. And if you really want it to be specific to a particular route, you could put that logic inside of the middleware itself and get it to check the route before it executes any logic. But there's another way that we can put it on specific routes, which we will be doing in this lesson. And the reason for that is that we have one endpoint, which is our lesson endpoint here, which we want to protect. But this course metadata endpoint, we actually don't want to protect because we need to be able to access this route even when we're not logged in. And so we'll show how to do that in the rest of this lesson. So all server middleware needs to be put into the server/middleware folder. And then we'll create a user middleware. And Nuxt will automatically find these middleware and register them and then execute them all. Now we'll create a pretty simple middleware for ourselves here. And so what this middleware does is we're going to import from the server module in Supabase. And this little hash here just tells Nuxt that we're trying to import from a specific package, and we're not going to rely on the auto imports. So we're going to get this server Supabase user composable, which does exactly what it sounds like it'll do. It will grab us the Supabase user, but it's designed to be used on the server. So this is the equivalent of the Supabase user composable that we use on the front end. Because of SSR things and different contexts and different data being available on the front end versus the back end, there this is split into two different functions. So we've got Supabase user, which is for the front end, and then this server specific one. And so all we're going to do here is every time we make a request, we're going to look for the Supabase user based on the request that's passed in. And then we're going to log out that user. So I'll just restart this to make sure that it picked up the middleware, because sometimes it doesn't always. And then if I go to this first page here, we can see we're just logging out null. And that's because we're not logged in. And so, of course, the user does not exist. If I go to a protected route and then I log in, now we see I am logged in, and now we see that logged out here is my user object. And so this contains all the user metadata and all the other stuff that comes with that object. And similarly, if I go to our hopscotch here, if I hit send, you'll see that we get null every single time. That's because we're not logged in with hopscotch. So how can we test this? Well, we would test this by using cookies, because Supabase uses cookies to determine or to keep our session alive, our user session. And it uses this cookie to get the user. And so that's what's happening here in this server Supabase user composable. We're passing in the event, and this event is the request that comes in. On that request are all the headers, which include the cookies. And from those cookies, it's able to pull out the user. So if we wanted to test this in hopscotch, we'd have to pass in cookies along with our request. But unfortunately, because hopscotch is a browser-based tool, it cannot add in cookies. And so that's a limitation of the browser. And there is an extension version that I believe has the ability to do this. Other tools that are not browser-based will be able to do this. But for right now, for us, this is a limitation. So we won't be testing the logged in route here. In order to do the authentication, instead of logging out the user, which doesn't really help us, we're going to add the user onto our event. And now for every request that comes in, we should be able to inspect that user in our routes and see if this user exists or not. We're also going to create a simple utility function. So we're going to create a folder called utils. Inside of that folder, we'll create a file called protectroute.ts. And this utility, this composable utility, is pretty straightforward. What we're doing here is we're going to look at the context and we're going to check to see if that user exists. And if they don't, we'll throw a 401 error. So now we have these two pieces. We've got our middleware, which adds the user onto every single request. And then we've got this protect route composable, which will, if the user does not exist, will throw an error returning 401. For our specific use case here, this may seem a little over-engineered. You might want to put this use Supabase user composable straight inside of a composable like this. And you may not even need to put all of this logic into a protect route composable. It's only a few lines of code. So you could put this into every single endpoint that you want to protect. and have custom logic there. And that totally works. My motivation here is to show you how you could use middleware in combination with a composable in order to do more complex logic and to break down these architecture into something that's a little bit more usable, where you've got a middleware that inspects and does something on every single request, and then you've got a composable that you can put in wherever you want in your endpoint logic that will then use that extra metadata that your middleware put. So now we need to actually use this protect route composable to protect our route. And so we'll go over to our lesson endpoint. And so at the very top of our event handler here, we'll add in the check that uses protect route. We'll also need to import protect route here. And now if we're not on the first chapter, we will run protect route. And this is all that we need now to make sure that the only way you can get to this route is if you are logged in. To show that this is indeed the case, if we run this again, we'll see that we get a 401 returned. This is all because of this chapter here, or this protect route here. But if we go over to get first lesson and we hit send, because it's not protecting the route on the first chapter, we get our data back as we would expect. So we're almost done here with using Auth to protect our server routes, but there's one issue with server-side rendering that we have to address. If I click around on the client side here, because the app is already loaded into the browser, things work as they should. But if I refresh the page, which will force it to go back to the server and render it on the server, we get this error that we could not fetch data. And the reason for that is that we need to make sure that we're passing the user session through cookies back and forth properly. By default, the SSR context does not have access to this cookie. So we need to fix that, and that's a pretty simple fix. We go to our use fetch with cache. And then over here, we're going to add in some headers, and the headers will be the cookie. Use request headers. And so what this does is when we're on the server side, we'll actually take the headers from the request that came in, which is causing the render to happen in the first place. We'll grab the cookie from that and then pass that along when we're doing our isometric fetch. So when we fetch on the client side, we have access to these cookies. By default, the browser will always pass these cookies along. But when we're on the server side, Nuxt does that fanciness where it will just call the method directly. But when we do that, that cookie is not present because it's just a method call. And so we need to make sure that Nuxt knows that we want to pass these headers along. So once we've done that, we refresh the page and we get all of our data as we expected. We can click around, it loads, and everything is working as it should. So in this lesson, we saw how we can use server middleware, and we saw how we can protect our routes using authentication. We also looked at a simple pattern for splitting things up and making it easy to do authentication and things like authentication on our server routes. We have a middleware that inspects the request and does something to that request. And then we have a separate composable that then works on that added metadata. In our next lesson, we will take a look at Nitro and H3, two important projects that are used heavily in Nuxt 3 and are important to understand in order to get the most out of Nuxt. So you may have noticed that we imported this H3 event type from H3, and that's because the server that Nuxt uses is Nitro, but Nitro uses H3 as its HTTP server. So if that's a little confusing to you, that's exactly why I've created this next lesson, which will explain all about Nitro and all about H3, how they work, why they exist, and why they're important.